A 10-year-old boy stands alone in a dusty parking lot, staring down 3 unmarked SUVs packed with heavily armed killers. He has exactly 5 seconds to scream before all hell breaks loose. What he does next saves the most notorious biker gang in America and changes his life forever. Barstow, California, is a town where the Mojave Desert threatens to swallow the asphalt alive. It's a place of cracked sidewalks, relentless sun, and the constant low-grade hum of highway traffic bleeding into the horizon. For 10-year-old Kevin Marshall, this unforgiving stretch of desert was the only world he had ever known. He lived with his mother, Sarah, in a cramped trailer just 2 miles down the road from her workplace, the Copper Skillet, an aging, sun-bleached diner that catered to weary long-haul truckers, lost tourists, and those who preferred to live their lives off the grid. Sarah was a woman worn thin by the friction of a hard life. Working double shifts just to keep the electricity humming and the pantry semi-stocked, she rarely had time to supervise Kevin. Consequently, the diner's parking lot became his playground. He spent his afternoons pushing battered Hot Wheels cars through the gravel, dreaming of the day he would escape the suffocating heat of Barstow. But Tuesday afternoons were different. Tuesdays were when the thunder rolled into town. You could feel them before you saw them, a deep, guttural vibration that started in the soles of your feet and rattled the cheap diner windows. It was the unmistakable roar of heavily modified Harley-Davidsons. A local charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club made the Copper Skillet their unofficial midweek sanctuary. They were a terrifying sight to the uninitiated, a procession of polished chrome, matte black leather, heavily tattooed arms, and the iconic Death's Head patch glaring from their backs. The locals gave them a wide berth, averting their eyes and whispering rumors. But to young Kevin, they were modern-day cowboys, larger than life. At the head of the pack was a man named Jim Henderson, though everyone in the underworld knew him simply as Big Jim. Jim was a mountain of a man, an imposing figure with a beard the color of steel wool and eyes that had seen more violence than a war documentary. He was the president of the charter, a man whose quietest whisper carried more weight than a politician's shout. Flanking him was his sergeant-at-arms, Colin Hayes, a lean, scarred enforcer with a reputation as sharp as a razor blade. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Hells Angels had an unspoken arrangement with Sarah. They tipped obscenely well, never started trouble inside the walls of the diner, and, surprisingly, they had a soft spot for the quiet kid playing in the dirt. On this particular Tuesday, the heat was suffocating, hovering near 104 degrees. The asphalt practically rippled with mirages. Big Jim kicked his kickstand down, the heavy thud signaling the rest of the pack to do the same. 15 bikes lined up perfectly. Jim pulled off his leather gloves, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked down at Kevin, who was sitting near the front tire of Jim's custom Street Glide. "Keep an eye on the iron, kid," Jim rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. He tossed a silver $half into the air. Kevin caught it, his eyes wide with reverence. "Yes, sir, Mr. Jim. Not a speck of dust gonna touch it." Jim offered a rare half-smile. "Good boy." The bikers filed into the diner, taking over the back section, the air conditioning instantly cooling their sweat-soaked leathers. Sarah moved quickly, pouring coffee and dropping menus, her hands trembling slightly, not out of fear of the bikers, but out of exhaustion. Inside it was loud, filled with coarse laughter and the clinking of heavy coffee mugs. Outside, the world was deadly quiet. Kevin pocketed the $half and began his self-appointed guard duty, walking the line of magnificent machines. He knew every detail of these bikes: the custom ape-hanger handlebars, the straight pipe exhausts, the intricate pinstriping. He was so engrossed in his inspection that he almost didn't notice the vehicles pulling into the abandoned gas station lot directly across the 2-lane highway. 3 pitch-black Chevrolet Suburbans, unmarked. Heavy, they moved with a predatory silence that stood in stark contrast to the roaring arrival of the bikers. Kevin paused, a toy car clutched in his dirt-smudged hand. He watched as the SUVs parked in a tight, tactical formation. The engines were cut simultaneously. For a moment nothing happened. The desert wind blew a tumbleweed across the cracked pavement. Then, The doors of the lead Suburban slid open. Kevin squinted against the glaring sun. Men began to pour out of the vehicles. They weren't wearing leather vests or motorcycle boots. They were dressed in dark utilitarian clothing, tactical vests over black long-sleeve shirts. But it was what they were holding that made the blood freeze in Kevin's 10-year-old veins. Automatic weapons, shotguns. One man, stepping out of the second vehicle, pulled a black ski mask over his face, racking the slide of an assault rifle. Even at his age, Kevin knew what he was looking at. He had heard the late-night whispers from the truckers. He knew about the rising tensions between the Hells Angels and a ruthless, heavily armed cartel syndicate operating out of the border towns, a group desperate to take control of the desert drug corridors. This wasn't a bar fight. This was an execution squad. There were at least 12 of them, heavily armed, organized, and moving with lethal intent toward the front doors of the Copper Skillet. Inside, Jim Henderson and his men were sitting ducks, trapped in a glass-fronted building with no rear exit, entirely focused on their coffee and burgers. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped Kevin. His instinct screamed at him to hide, to crawl under Big Jim's massive Harley and wait for the nightmare to pass. If he stayed out of sight, he would be safe. But he looked at the diner window. He could see his mother behind the counter pouring a pot of coffee. He saw Jim laughing at something Colin Hayes had just said. They had 5 seconds before the men crossed the street. 5 seconds before the slaughter began. Kevin dropped his toy car. The metal clattered against the asphalt. He didn't hide. He took a deep breath, his small chest expanding, and his legs began to move. Kevin's sneakers slapped against the burning pavement. He didn't run away from the danger. He ran directly across the line of fire, sprinting toward the heavy glass doors of the diner. Across the street, the leader of the hit squad saw the kid running. He raised his hand, signaling his men to pick up the pace. They broke into a tactical jog, weapons raised, fingers brushing against triggers. Kevin hit the diner door with his shoulder, bursting into the air-conditioned room. The sudden noise of the bell violently clanging against the glass made a few patrons look up, annoyed. "Arun!" Kevin screamed, his pre-pubescent voice cracking, echoing over the jukebox that was playing an old Johnny Cash tune. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that instantly silenced the room. "It's an ambush. They have guns." All sighed. He pointed frantically at the front windows. Most of the ordinary patrons froze, confused by the screaming child. But Big Jim Henderson didn't freeze. A man doesn't survive 30 years in the Hells Angels by hesitating. Before Kevin had even finished his sentence, Jim's eyes locked onto the front windows. He saw the dark shapes moving rapidly across the blinding glare of the street. He saw the black steel of the rifles. "Don!" Jim roared, a sound so thunderous it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In a fraction of a second, the lethargic, relaxed atmosphere of the diner vanished. Survival instincts hardwired by decades of street warfare took over. Colin Hayes grabbed the edge of the heavy oak booth table and flipped it violently onto its side, creating a makeshift barricade. The other angels moved with terrifying synchronization, drawing heavy-caliber handguns from their waistbands and throwing themselves to the linoleum floor. Sarah, standing behind the counter, dropped the glass coffee pot. It shattered, sending scalding brown liquid across the tiles. "Mom!" Kevin shrieked. Big Jim lunged forward, grabbing Kevin by the back of his shirt and throwing him behind the thick, stainless steel front counter. "Get your head down, Sarah. Cover the boy." Jim barked, drawing a massive .45 caliber 1911 pistol from his leather vest. Less than 2 seconds after Kevin's warning, the world outside erupted. The sound was deafening. It wasn't like in the movies. It was a physical force, a concussive wave of pressure that hammered against their eardrums. Automatic gunfire tore through the front of the Copper Skillet. The large plate glass windows didn't just break. They exploded inward in a lethal storm of jagged shards. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Wood splintered. Sugar shakers exploded into white dust. The neon open sign sparked violently and died, raining sparks onto the booze. A terrified trucker diving for cover screamed as a stray bullet tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder. But the cartel hitmen had miscalculated. They expected to catch the bikers entirely by surprise, to slaughter them in their booths before a single shot could be fired back. Kevin's 5-second warning had ruined their element of surprise. From behind the overturned tables and the shattered remnants of the booths, the Hells Angels returned fire. The deep, rhythmic booming of the bikers' heavy handguns answered the high-pitched chatter of the cartel's assault rifles. Jim Henderson leaned out from behind the edge of the counter, his face a mask of cold fury, and squeezed the trigger of his .45. The heavy recoil kicked his arm back, but his aim was true. Outside, one of the masked attackers taking cover behind a parked car dropped instantly, a red mist spraying the hot asphalt. "Flank 'em, Colin!" Jim shouted over the din of the gunfire. "Don't let them pin us." Colin Hayes and 2 other bikers, crawling on their bellies through the broken glass and spilled ketchup, made their way toward the side kitchen door. Behind the counter, Kevin was curled into a tight ball, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. The noise was unbearable. He could smell the acrid, sulphurous stench of gunpowder, mixed with the smell of burning grease from the grill. Sarah was draped over him, her body acting as a human shield, sobbing prayers into his hair. "It's okay, baby. Don't look." "Don't look," she whispered, though she couldn't hear her own voice. Outside, the hit squad realized the tide was turning. The crossfire was brutal. The Angels weren't just returning fire. They were fighting with a savage, organized precision. When Colin and his men burst from the side alley, flanking the shooters and unleashing a barrage of fire from unexpected angles, the cartel's discipline broke. "Fall back, move," a muffled voice yelled from the street. The attackers laid down a final desperate wave of suppressing fire, tearing the remaining booths to shreds, before scrambling back toward their SUVs. Tires squealed in panic, leaving thick black streaks of burning rubber on the road as the 3 suburbans tore out of the lot, speeding recklessly toward the interstate. Then silence. The ringing in everyone's ears was absolute. The diner was completely destroyed. Sunlight streamed through the bullet holes in the walls, illuminating the thick clouds of dust and drywall lingering in the air. Blood pooled near the front entrance where one of the bikers had taken a grazing shot to the leg. Groans of pain and shock began to filter through the destruction. Jim Henderson slowly stood up, brushing shattered glass off his leather cuts. He kept his gun drawn, scanning the empty street, his chest heaving. He looked at Colin, who nodded from the alleyway, signaling the threat was gone. "Everyone alive?" Jim demanded, his voice slicing through the shock of the room. A chorus of grunts and confirmations answered him. The Angels had survived, battered, bleeding, but alive. Jim turned, holstering his weapon, and walked over to the counter. He reached over the stainless steel rim and looked down. Sarah was shaking uncontrollably, still covering her son. Kevin slowly opened his eyes, looking up at the giant biker. Jim didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the 10-year-old boy. Jim knew the brutal mathematics of street warfare. If that kid hadn't sprinted into the diner, if he hadn't screamed when he did, the Angels would still have been sitting in those booths when the glass shattered. None of them would have walked out alive. The wail of police sirens began to echo in the far distance. "Cops are coming, Jim," Colin said, limping back into the ruined diner. "We can't be here. You know the drill." The Hells Angels did not talk to the police, ever. Surviving an ambush was one thing. Getting tied up in a massive federal investigation was another. They had to ghost. Jim nodded slowly. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a heavy, scuffed brass Zippo lighter. Engraved on the side was the club's insignia. He reached down and pressed the cold metal into Kevin's trembling, dirty hand. "You saved my brothers today, Kevin," Jim said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "You're a brave kid, a warrior. You keep that. Anyone ever gives you trouble, you show them that brass. You tell 'em Big Jim sent you." Jim stood up, dropping a thick roll of $100 bills onto the counter next to Sarah. "For the damages, ma'am. Get the boy out of town for a few days." With that, the bikers moved out. They grabbed their wounded, mounted their Harleys, and roared down the highway in the opposite direction of the approaching sirens, disappearing into the heat shimmer of the Mojave Desert. When the police arrived 3 minutes later, they found a shattered diner, terrified patrons, and a 10-year-old boy clutching a brass lighter. Kevin thought the nightmare was over. He thought the danger had sped away in those black SUVs. But as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his pale face, he didn't realize the terrifying truth. The men in the SUVs weren't just random thugs. They were the apex predators of the desert. And in the chaos of their retreat, the cartel leader had seen exactly who ruined his perfect hit. He had seen the kid in the window. The ambush had failed. But the true nightmare for Kevin Marshall was only just beginning. Over the next 24 hours, his world was about to be turned upside down. The local police kept Sarah and Kevin at the Barstow precinct for 6 grueling hours. Detectives badgered them with questions, sliding photographs of known cartel operatives and Hells Angels members across the metal tables. Sarah played the part of the traumatized, oblivious waitress perfectly, insisting she had ducked behind the counter the moment the glass broke and hadn't seen a thing. Kevin, clutching his mother's hand, simply stared at his sneakers, refusing to say a word. Deep in his pocket, his fingers traced the cold, hard engraving of the brass Zippo. By the time they were finally released, the desert sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the Mojave into a deep, chilling blackness. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a biting wind that howled through the canyons. Sarah drove their sputtering, rust-eaten Ford Taurus back to their trailer park on the edge of town. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She knew the roll of $100 bills sitting in her purse was their only ticket out of Barstow, and she intended to use it. "Pack your backpack, Kevin," she ordered the second she locked the flimsy aluminum door of their trailer behind them. "Just your clothes and your toothbrush. We're leaving tonight." "Where are we going?" Kevin asked, his voice barely a whisper. The adrenaline of the afternoon had completely worn off, leaving him hollow and shivering. "Anywhere but here, baby. Up north. Washington, maybe." Sarah began pulling duffel bags from the hallway closet, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Outside the trailer park was unsettlingly quiet. Usually the gravel roads were filled with the sounds of arguing neighbors, barking stray dogs, and the distant hum of the interstate. Tonight there was nothing. It was the kind of suffocating silence that heavy predators bring with them into the wild. At 11:45 p.m., the lone street lamp illuminating their dirt driveway suddenly flickered and died. Sarah froze, a stack of folded jeans in her hands. She looked toward the small, curtained window of the living room. Crunch, crunch. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy boots walking on the gravel outside. Not just one pair. Several. "Mom?" Kevin whispered, his eyes wide. "Shh," Sarah hissed, dropping the clothes. She crept toward the window and peeked through a tiny slit in the faded curtains. Her blood turned to ice. Parked at the entrance of the trailer park, headlights cut, was a black Chevrolet Suburban. The single father named. 3 men were fanning out across their small patch of dead grass, moving with terrifying, silent precision. They were dressed in black, tactical gear. The man in the center, a towering brute named Dalton, a ruthless contractor known for cleaning up the cartel's messes, carried a suppressed MAC-10 submachine gun. He was staring directly at their front door. They hadn't come to silence witnesses. They had come to send a message to the Hells Angels. The cartel wanted the bikers to know that anyone who helped them, even a 10-year-old boy, would pay the ultimate price. "Kevin, into the floorboard," Sarah commanded, her voice trembling but fierce. She dragged him toward the narrow hallway. Beneath the cheap linoleum was a small, hollow maintenance panel where the water heater used to sit before it broke. It was barely big enough for a child. "I'm not leaving you!" Kevin cried, tears finally spilling hot down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "You get in there, and you don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Sarah yanked the wooden panel up, practically shoving him into the dark, dusty cavity. She slammed the board back down just as a thunderous crash shattered the front of the trailer. Dalton hadn't bothered picking the lock. He had kicked the cheap aluminum door entirely off its hinges. The trailer shook violently as the men stormed inside. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, weeping over the worn couch and the half-packed duffel bags. "Check the back," Dalton's voice barked, cold and devoid of any human empathy. "Find the kid." Sarah backed into the kitchen, grabbing the only weapon she had, a heavy iron skillet from the stove. She raised it, her breathing ragged, ready to fight to the death. A flashlight beam caught her in the face, blinding her. "Drop it, sweetheart," Dalton sneered, stepping into the kitchen. He raised the suppressed submachine gun, pointing it directly at her chest. "Or don't. Makes no difference to me." "He's not here," Sarah screamed, stepping in front of the hallway entrance. "He ran away. He's gone." Dalton chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He stepped closer, the muzzle of the weapon inches from her face. "You see, the problem with this town is that everybody talks. The cops talk. The neighbors talk. We know he's here. He cost my employers a lot of money and a lot of pride today. Now step aside, or I paint this kitchen with you." Beneath the floorboards, Kevin clamped both hands over his mouth to muffle his terrified sobs. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hand digging furiously into his pocket. His fingers wrapped tightly around the brass Zippo lighter. "You tell 'em Big Jim sent you." The words echoed in his mind, feeling like a cruel joke now. Big Jim was gone. They were completely alone. Dalton raised his hand to strike Sarah out of the way. Then, the floorboards began to vibrate. It didn't start as a sound. It started as a tremor deep in the earth, shaking the cheap walls of the trailer and rattling the dishes in the sink. Dalton paused, lowering his hand, his brow furrowing in confusion. One of his men stepped out of the back bedroom, looking equally bewildered. "What the hell is that?" the grunt asked. The vibration rapidly escalated into a deafening, thunderous roar that tore through the quiet desert night. It sounded like a freight train was barreling directly through the trailer park. Headlights, dozens of them, suddenly flooded through the broken front door, illuminating the dust-filled air of the living room with blinding, chaotic light. Dalton spun around, raising his weapon toward the doorway, but he was too late. The Hells Angels hadn't abandoned Barstow. Big Jim Henderson was not a man who left loose ends, and he certainly wasn't a man who left a debt unpaid. He knew exactly how the cartel operated. He knew that the moment the sun went down, they would come for the boy who had embarrassed them. Jim had parked his convoy just 3 miles up a hidden dirt ridge, waiting for the wolves to show their faces. They didn't just bring 15 bikes this time, they brought 40. The front windows of the trailer shattered inward as heavy steel-toed motorcycle boots kicked them in. Colin Hayes lunged through the window frame like a shadow, tackling one of Dalton's men to the ground before the man could even raise his rifle. A brutal close-quarters brawl erupted instantly. Outside. "Move!" Dalton screamed, realizing they were completely surrounded and outnumbered 10-1. He fired a blind burst from his MAC-10 toward the window, but a massive hand reached through the broken front doorway, grabbing Dalton by the tactical vest and ripping him entirely out of the trailer. Sarah fell to her knees, scrambling backward as the chaos spilled out into the dirt driveway. Outside, it was absolute pandemonium. The deep, guttural roar of idling Harleys drowned out the shouts of the cartel hitmen. The bikers moved with a terrifying, coordinated brutality. They disarmed Dalton's crew in seconds, pinning them to the hoods of the Suburbans. Big Jim Henderson stood over Dalton in the dirt. The cartel enforcer was bleeding from a broken nose, gasping for air. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Dalton," Jim rumbled, his voice cutting through the noise of the idling engines. He racked the slide of his massive .45 caliber pistol and pressed it against the enforcer's forehead. "This town belongs to the club, and that family in there. They are under club protection. You come back here, you send anyone else, and I won't just kill you. I'll ride south and burn your boss's compound to the ash." Dalton, wide-eyed and choking on dust, nodded frantically. "Get your trash out of my sight," Jim spat, stepping back. The headmen didn't hesitate. Battered, bruised, and thoroughly defeated, they scrambled into their SUV, threw it into reverse, and tore out of the trailer park, disappearing into the darkness. Silence fell over the yard once more, save for the low, rhythmic idle of 40 V-twin engines. Jim holstered his weapon and walked slowly back into the ruined trailer. He looked down at Sarah, who was still trembling on the kitchen floor. "You can let him out now, ma'am," Jim said softly. Sarah scrambled to the hallway and tore the wooden panel open. Kevin emerged, covered in dust and cobwebs, gasping for air. When he saw the giant bearded biker standing in his living room, he didn't cry. He ran forward and wrapped his small arms around Jim's heavy leather vest. Jim, a man feared by law enforcement and criminals alike across the West Coast, awkwardly placed a massive, scarred hand on the boy's back. "Told you to keep an eye on the iron, kid," Jim muttered. "Didn't expect you to take on an army for us." "They were gonna hurt my mom," Kevin sniffled. "Not anymore," Jim said, looking up at Sarah. "Pack whatever you can carry in 10 minutes. Barstow isn't safe for you anymore. Even with the warning I just gave them, you'll always be looking over your shoulder. The club has a property up in the Pacific Northwest. Quiet town, good schools. You're gonna take it." Sarah wiped her tears, looking at the giant biker in disbelief. "We can't afford that. We don't have anything." Jim offered a rare, genuine smile. "Rent's paid in full, Sarah. For as long as you need it, you save my brothers. In our world, that makes you family." That night, Kevin Marshall didn't fall asleep to the sound of highway traffic. He fell asleep in the sleeper cab of an 18-wheeler driven by a club associate, flanked on all sides by a heavily armed escort of Hell's Angels riding into the dawn. 24 hours earlier, Kevin had been a lonely kid playing in the dirt of a dead-end town. Today, his life had changed forever. He had lost his home, but he had gained something entirely unexpected. An army of fiercely loyal, leather-clad uncles who would ensure that no one ever laid a finger on him again. Years later, Kevin would graduate college, far away from the desert heat. He lived a quiet, successful life, but he never forgot the roar of the engines. And he never, under any circumstances, left the house without the heavy brass Zippo lighter safely tucked in his pocket. If this real-life story of loyalty, survival, and an unlikely bond kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling stories. What would you have done in Kevin's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next video.